Hello, internet people. This is Dan here, and I'm doing a video on Venus retrograde. The date is December the 19th. We're really close to winter solstice, and Venus has just stationed retrograde recently. And I'm just going to get right into it here. Some basic Venus retrograde facts is that a Venus retrograde happens approximately every 1.5 years. It lasts for about 6 weeks, and it's part of what is called a synodic cycle. Every planet has one. The nature of synodic cycles are a bit different whether they're considered to be inner or outer planets. And in this sense, I'm counting Jupiter and Saturn as outer planets. That if you know, it's of I guess if you look, consider the which ones are closer to the sun compared to Earth, and which ones are farther away from the sun compared to Earth. The natures of the synodic cycle is going to be a bit different. I'm not going to get into all those kind of technical details, though, but the main important thing to understand about a synodic cycle is that there's a change, basically, in the status of Venus being a morning star versus an evening star. When Venus goes retrograde, it basically starts off with Venus as an evening star, with the sun on one side of Venus, and then Venus will retrograde, cross paths with the sun, which is combustion, and then when Venus is perfectly conjunct the sun, it's called cazimi. And then after crossing the path of the sun, Venus is now on the other side of the sun, which means that when in the morning, Venus will rise as a morning star, and then the sun will come up, because they've switched places, basically. And from a symbolic perspective, this is a kind of the death and rebirth motif for Venus, because you've got an old Venus kind of weakening and perishing away, and then getting this kind of moment of being recharged and revitalized by the cazimi with the sun, and then coming out of that as like a new, young, fresh Venus, a new Venus cycle, that kind of thing. But don't get your hopes up too much, though, because with this particular Venus retrograde, once it's over, it kind of leads into a lot of trouble for Venus, which we'll get into later. But basically, we've got both Venus running into Mars and then eventually Saturn, as if Pluto itself was not difficult enough for an interaction with Venus. You've got all sorts of crazy Venus action coming up. I was also thinking that it's Pluto is often associated with this whole death and rebirth motif. So when you combine a Venus retrograde with the conjunction with Pluto, then this whole death rebirth thing could be kind of doubled up in different ways. Before Now, it's kind of a complicated thing with all the dynamics going on, but I thought I would just make a few comments about Venus retrogrades in general. For one thing, I still consider myself to be a fairly new astrologer. I've been doing it for about 5 years. Um, and I don't know, like maybe for some things, 5 years is a long time to be doing things, but I kind of feel like 5 years of learning astrology is sort of like, I mean, it doesn't even feel, I kind of mentioned this in my last video, is that it doesn't even feel like 5 years. It kind of went by in a blur. And, but yeah, I mean, some people have been doing astrology for decades, for their whole lives and stuff like that. And my main point is that if people who have longer experience doing astrology probably have more memories of different transits, like, oh, I remember that Venus retrograde and how that happened, and you have more of your own personal life experience in which to draw on. And for me, like Venus retrograde was not something that I really even paid attention to at all or was even aware of until 5 years ago. And as such, in my own within that time frame, there's only been 3 Venus retrogrades that I can kind of count. And so this will be like the fourth Venus retrograde with me being an astrologer and being able to like kind of like pay attention to it and understand it as a Venus retrograde. Now, it's like if I can use my astrology software to look back on years prior to when I started learning astrology and kind of retrospectively looking at different things that were going on. But to be honest, like my own memory of like remembering when certain events happened, it's kind of fuzzy. So like it would be hard for me to I can like vaguely remember, oh yeah, this thing happened with this person around this year, but I may not know what month so it's a bit fuzzy is basically my point. But just going off of the last few Venus retrogrades that we've had over the last 5 years or so, what I've noticed about them is um, there seems to be a general change in my social life, I guess you could say. No, I mean, like, the main stereotype that people use, I think, to understand Venus retrograde is like your ex shows up and you have to deal with your ex. Now, um, I I don't. Maybe we shouldn't go there right away. But I mean, I guess let's just get that one out of the way. Um, I I don't know if that's really the best way to understand it. And I have to like I can't. For some reason, it's very difficult for me to talk about the whole dealing with your ex subject without mentioning the fact that like my most recent ex girlfriend has been the kind to repeatedly try to contact me in what people would associate with a Venus retrograde fashion multiple times since we broke up, and it hasn't been Venus retrograding. So it's like I I don't necessarily think that it's like Venus retrogrades are the only time that your ex will try to contact you and try to make amends or whatever your ex is trying to do. In my own experience, that like they will, if your ex is that kind of person, they will probably do it regardless of Venus retrograde. But in my own experience, when I look at the patterns of Venus retrograde, it's often like not it Venus doesn't even necessarily have to specifically concern romantic boyfriend girlfriend or whatever your preference is, romantic sexual partnerships or whatever. That could just be platonic friends, you and your homies, or whatever expression you want to use. That could just as equally be affected by Venus retrograde. And I think it's generally a time, if you think about the nature of a retrograde is that you've got a planet that's moving in one direction and then gradually it slows down, kind of goes around the bend, goes around the corner, and is going in a different direction. And when you apply that to planet Venus, which has primarily relates to things like relationships and friendships and social life, it can also do some other things as well. But what that seems to do is have the effect of, whether this is friendship or relationship or whatever, you're moving in one direction with the people that you usually spend time with and socialize with, or your partner or whatever. And then the retrograde seems to have an effect of a kind of a reappraisal of the whole situation, like asking the question, like, do you really want to move ahead and continue going in the same direction with this person or people, and maybe out of this, maybe there may be even new opportunities to go in a different direction that present themselves. Um, what I have found is that there may be certain problems in friendships or relationships, Venus retrogrades seem to do a good job of bringing those problems to the forefront. Um, and that if you are already having problems with somebody, and it could sort of have the effect of making the friendship or relationship feel like it's kind of hanging by a thin thread, and to the point which you may even just be like, okay, I've had it with this, I'm making it change, I'm doing something different. um and which is, I mean, like, if I look back at the previous Venus retrogrades, it's actually kind of striking how each of them has sort of had that dynamic play a role. Um, and there being a kind of like hanging out from one kind of usual best friend or person you see to like another friend that you see a lot, versus having having a girlfriend come in and then having your friend get jealous over the girlfriend or something. I don't want to get all into the my personal life, but those patterns I can see strongly correlate with the Venus retrograde cycle. um and the most recent one, for me anyways, didn't actually end up resulting in an immediate change, but it was sort of like I was in a relationship, and over the course of the retrograde, yeah, the different problems sort of came up to the surface, and it sort of gradually kind of eroded my enthusiasm or confidence or feeling like this is really a relationship that I wanted to be in. That was slowly getting eroded to the point that by the end of the retrograde, it kind of culminated in a big fight where I was kind of left really not having a lot of confidence in wanting to continue the relationship. And it was like a few months later, I guess. I mean, that happened in the summer of 2020. It was like, um, a few months later, anyways, into the fall, that it culminated in officially breaking up. So it wasn't like I broke up in the Venus retrograde itself, but I can see that the retrograde period was a period when the tensions really came to the surface and really had the effect of convincing me that it wasn't something that I wanted to be a part of any longer, basically. And then it just, yeah, took a while after that for it to really like kind of come into effect, I suppose you could say. Um, but so, anyways, in it's a good time, I guess, for reevaluating relationships, or seeing having all the potential problems come to the surface. Um, or if it's not relationships, it could be friendships. Like, um, yeah, I mean, there might be things that you kind of go unquestioned about the usual people you pal around with, whatever areas of tension or problem areas will have pressure put on them, and may have the effect of forcing you to make a kind of a decision about like whether you want to keep going with it or not, or maybe it'll just fall apart on its own. These are the kinds of things that I think you can expect from a Venus retrograde. um, some other possibilities to consider is that it could be that if you are in a kind of ambiguous situation with somebody, I mean, an easy example could be you don't know whether you're just friends with somebody in a platonic sense, or if it has romantic potential, or maybe even in terms of friends, like you don't know, like you kind of have an acquaintance but you're not really sure if this is like a good friend material or just somebody that you say hi to a couple times, like that. Like these kinds of areas of ambiguity in friendships and relationships could be clarified by the process of a Venus retrograde. Like you could start off being like, I don't really know what's up with this person, where I stand with them, and then through that kind of where Venus slows down, backs up, goes backward, and kind of just goes over all this stuff, and then by the time Venus is going forward, then you're like, oh, okay, like now we've got that sorted out, and you know where you stand with somebody, for better or worse, right? Like it could like or yeah, so that's another thing. Um, it could also be that like maybe there's somebody from the past who comes back. I mean, that's kind of like the stereotype of Venus retrograde, is a past ex kind of making an appearance. But that's another thing where it's like you think you've moved on, but Venus goes back to like there's some sort of like thing that you have to learn from that person, or maybe somebody who you thought was out of the picture isn't out of the picture anymore or something, and they make a reappearance. But I mean, I think that's kind of like, it's almost like the cliche understanding of what Venus retrograde is. And I was trying to anyways give a bit of a broader definition or a broader understanding of what happens based on my own experience. This particular Venus retrograde, hold on. Okay, so here's the bad news. Unfortunately, this particular Venus retrograde does not look like a particularly easy one, or I'm tempted to say a particularly good one. I mean, I'm not the kind of astrologer who just is like, oh, there's no good and bad transits. It's all just how you vibrate with it or something. I'm just gonna like flat out say that this looks like a particularly difficult Venus retrograde. And I can basically break that down into there's two main factors of why this Venus retrograde is more difficult than usual. First of all, that Venus is conjunct with Pluto, and that with the with the whole retrogradation combined with a conjunction means that Venus will be making multiple passes with Pluto, first going across Pluto in forward motion, then hitting station retrograde, then going over Pluto retrograde, then after stationing direct, then going over Pluto again a third time. So you've got the constant kind of like dance between Venus and Pluto. The other thing is basically what happens once the Venus retrograde is finished, which is a encounter with Mars, which is kind of awkward because, I mean, usually Venus and Mars travel at different speeds, where Venus moves considerably quicker than Mars. But because Venus retrograde has the effect of slowing down around stations, whether it's stationing direct or stationing retrograde, right as Venus is stationing direct, when it slows down and then slowly starts moving in the other direction, there's a conjunction with Mars, and then Venus is stuck in a Mars conjunction for a considerable period of time, and then after that, it just basically gets worse because, like, I mean, this kind of goes beyond the retrograde because this is quite out of the retrograde, but eventually, once Venus progresses into Aquarius, Venus will find herself in a position where she's enclosed by the malefics, basically, where you've got Mars on one side and Saturn on the other side, where you've got being like cornered in between like the two bad guys of astrology. It's not a very good place for Venus to be. I will. I can do a graphic illustration of what that looks like with my astrology program if you need to sort of like hammer it in. And it's, I mean, I was thinking about talking about Venus and Pluto first, but the way the flow is going, maybe I'll just do that, do this I'll show you what I mean by where this retrograde is going. I might as well. That's where the flow feels like it's going for me. So, this is my astrology program. I do this recording on an iPad. I mean, that's just how I've got my stuff set up right now. Um, anyways, so here we have December 19th, Venus is retrograde. I guess we can even back it up if you want to see like the exact point Venus went retrograde. So here we go. December 19th in the wee hours, like this is just after midnight. It's around 3 a.m. 2:47. I mean, I could go down to like the minute, but here you go. In the wee hours of the morning, this morning, Venus stationed retrograde. And here you can see Venus down at the bottom of the screen there, conjunct with Pluto. And I will just sort of scroll through this whole thing day by day here. So, as you can see, Venus is at 26, retrogrades back to 25 for another conjunction with Pluto. And interestingly enough, this is December 24th, December 25th. So we have like the perfection of Venus and Pluto right over Christmas, which is like a little bit weird, if you ask me. Kind of weird timing. And as a side note, I decided to watch the movie Eyes Wide Shut, Stanley Kubrick's last movie before he died. And not only do I think that there's some very strong Venus Pluto elements in that movie, because it's like, you know, a weird secret society sex cult kind of plot line, which is very kind of like that Pluto secret power control, the shadowy Pluto cabal, or, you know, those are all like Pluto kind of archetype themes. And like the sort of like the tensions in Nicole Kidman and Tom Cruise relationship being kind of a indicative of Venus retrograde, that it kind of goes with both a Venus retrograde and a Pluto theme. And on top of that, the movie is set during Christmas. So it's like, it seems kind of weirdly appropriate in some way. I don't know. I just thought I'd mention that. Anyways, that's one sort of association I have. So anyways, continuing on here, Venus keeps retrograding, then ends up having a conjunction. It's like a triple conjunction with Mercury and Pluto around December 29th. That's kind of interesting. And as we keep going, you notice the sun is getting closer to Venus here. So eventually, as we get into the new year, we have a new moon now. So we have a new moon in Capricorn with Venus conjunct. No, it's not really. Venus isn't really conjunct the new moon, but I mean, it's like close enough that the new moon is going to be a very Venus retrograde flavored new moon. Anyways, so we keep going, and now you see Mars in Sagittarius is sort of creeping up here, right? So we keep going, and then near the end of January, January 25th, Mars pops into Capricorn. Now, remember too that Mars is exalted in Capricorn, so this is actually a good placement for Mars to be in. Mars is kind of strong and activated by being in Capricorn, which is good for Mars, but maybe not so good for Venus. What happens is, as you keep going here, Venus. Okay, here we go. The Venus retrograde ends. The retrograde period ends. Venus stations direct here around January 29th. But Mars is closing in as you keep going. See, Venus is slow now. This is actually a weird thing, because now Mars is actually moving faster than Venus, because Venus is in that slow, just coming out of the retrograde, and Mars is like creeping up on Venus bit by bit until now Mars is within 2 degrees on February 7th. As you keep going, now Mars is just within 1 degree, and it's just kind of like this slowly gaining on Venus here. The conjunction is pretty tight, and and then eventually you get a perfect conjunction between Mars and Venus right on Valentine's Day, which is kind of, I mean, this is going to make for a really interesting Valentine's Day next year. I'm not sure if it's going to be interesting in a good way, though. But yeah, so as we keep going, we have the Mars-Venus conjunction continues. It basically just keeps going, 17 degrees, 18 degrees, right? Like they're perfectly conjunct for quite a while because they're moving at the same speed, going towards Aquarius here. And then, to make, this is basically, we're way out of I don't know, we're way out of it. We're basically approaching the point now. This is around the point where Venus leaves the shadow period. Because if you remember, Venus stationed, 25 degrees or 26 degrees? 26 degrees is where Venus is stationed. So like, this is basically the retrograde period, concluding the retrograde shadow, is over at this point, now that we've entered into March here. But what do you have? You've got a Mars, Pluto, Venus triple conjunction, which is not, like, it's not very good at all. This is actually pretty gnarly. And then, to make things worse, if you keep going, eventually, after they're done with Pluto, they pop into Aquarius here, and now you've got Venus moving. I mean, they're still pretty conjunct. Look, 3 degrees, perfect conjunctions. Eventually, Venus starts breaking away from Mars. She's only 1 degree here. But as she moves away from the Mars conjunction, here she is what you call enclosure between malefics, enclosed between Mars and Saturn, into March, March 20th. It's a pretty difficult kind of situation. If I keep kind of going along with this, though, you've got Venus conjunct Saturn here, March 28th. Eventually, Venus gets over the Saturn conjunction, and then you've got Mars conjunct Saturn. And then finally you've got Venus in Pisces, which is where her place of exaltation, and she gets to share it with the Jupiter-Neptune conjunction. And that's into April, which is like, I mean, it's interesting timing that finally after all of that, Venus gets into Pisces, which is a better place for Venus to be. And sharing the sign with Jupiter is a good thing, but when you put Jupiter and Neptune together, then that creates an interesting dynamic where there might be a kind of like, a kind of diluted Venus. It would be the problem, perhaps, or being kind of taken up by some kind of Piscean dream, which seems like it is better than it really is. But that we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves because we're all the way into April at this point. But it's kind of interesting to use the retrograde as a kind of a launching point to see what kind of trajectory that we have going into 2022 here, and truly using astrology to give us a view of what's coming around the corner. I think, okay, I'll close my program at this point. Okay, so by showing you with my program there, Astro Gold, what all the things Venus is going to be going through for this first quarter of 2022, it does go beyond the scope of just talking about Venus retrograde, though. But I think it's important to include it because for people who are watching this video with the what should I expect from a Venus retrograde, is that I think this is a particularly it's particularly important to be careful with this retrograde because we can see where it is headed, the direction things are headed, and what situation comes directly following the retrograde is not going to be a particularly good one for Venus-related stuff. So basically, Like, I don't know if people like I don't know if anybody like looks at a Venus retrograde from the point of view of somebody who's up on astrology and it's like, oh great, it's Venus retrograde. What a great time to like call up my ex boyfriends or girlfriends and you know, or whatever, get in touch with old friends and make amends and have everything be nice. And it's like, or people may just end up doing this kind of stuff. It's probably more likely that people do this stuff without being aware of the astrology, kind of unconsciously, like they're being unconsciously moved by these forces. And the reason why we do astrology is that we can be like, oh, okay, so these are the forces that we're going to be contending with. Now that I'm aware that that's a factor, I can maybe make some choices that will not have me being pushed around by these forces so unconsciously, and maybe I can be alert not to make mistakes or get myself into some kind of a mess that is only going to cause trouble for me later on. And I do think that the fact that well, I mean, there's something about this too, which I don't think it's necessarily a laughing matter because um, I mean, I like to take things a bit more light and stuff like that, but I think that there could be a strong correlation with things um, like I don't want to alarm anybody either, but um, with the presence of Pluto and Mars, there could be the quality of violence, maybe even like sexual violence or something like that. Um, Remember that in 2017, the whole thing about the Me Too movement happened coming off of the heels of a Venus Mars conjunction. And I don't think that in all cases Venus and Mars together represents like some kind of like sexual assault or something like that, but there's definitely those themes are associated with Mars and Venus and Pluto. All when you add those three planets up, you do get those themes, and that could be a factor in some cases. Um, I think that there's I wrote down some notes of like I was kind of brainstorming some stuff around this. So like I'll kind of go over this basically. When you factor in the presence of Pluto and Mars, this is primarily Pluto stuff that I was working on here. Pluto, I've mentioned in videos before that um, there's a book that I like from James Hillman, one of the classic James Hillman books called Dream and the Underworld. And in Dream and the Underworld, he talks about how the archetype. He's not specifically talking about the astrological Pluto, but he is talking about the broader archetype of the underworld, which basically that's Hades. That's what Pluto's associated with. Um, and he was talking about this idea about how there's the crossing of the river Styx, and that the crossing of the river Styx is associated archetypically with a kind of hatred. Um, and if you can imagine what we mean by hatred in this sense, it's like river Styx acts as a kind of a barrier. From on one side is the land of the dead, and that the guy takes you across on the boat when your soul to the land of the dead and stuff like that. And because the basic idea is that like because as human beings we've got a very strong biological mechanism that is wired for our survival, basically to perpetuate life at all costs, and to have a very strong aversion to death and dying, which I mean I shouldn't have to explain. I think this is just a like inbuilt quality of being a living being, whether you're human or animal or whatever. But as such, this is kind of where some of the Pluto themes come from. You could see it as being part of the sexual themes, as the biological drive to reproduce and have offspring to continue perpetuating the life forms, your species survival of the human race. But then if you, rather than getting into the sort of perpetuating life through the generations, you can narrow it back down to the even just your own individual survival, where there, when faced with the prospect of our own mortality, it can be like the prospect of death is terrifying, and that, like if you can imagine yourself in some sort of like, I don't know, like if you were starving to death, you would eat whatever you could find to keep living, even if it was really gross or something like that. Because as much as the aversion to some gross thing that you would eat it's not as strong as the aversion to death, basically, right? The death kind of represents the sort of like ultimate aversion of aversions. And so, but okay, but just because we have Pluto active in a transit doesn't necessarily mean there's going to involve literal death or anything like that, because we have Pluto transits all the time. I mean, some of them, you know, certainly maybe involve death, but I mean the in general though that if it doesn't involve the literal problem of mortality and dying and stuff like that, there's still this sense of a very, very strong aversion that with Pluto can come across as a kind of a hatred. Um, and that's one problem that can come up. Well, when you combine that with a Venus retrograde, it's not looking very good. For example, if we go with the classic stereotype of a Venus, Venus retrograde, meaning that your ex suddenly shows up, like it could be like the ex shows up, but you really hate them and you don't want to get like you're not going to give them the time of day at all, and there's this big clash. Or, I mean, it could also be a kind of obsession or something like that. Um, I'll, I mean, to keep going with it, there's some other things. Some other things that are associated with Pluto is the quality of secrets, taboos, things which are hidden and covered up, and generally, things that we keep secret or cover up could be because they're embarrassing, that you don't want people to know about them, or that could get into deeper problems of, shame or regret or something. And so another possible outcome could be that, like, maybe in a moment of weakness, if you want to go with the classic your ex shows up stereotype, that you get back, you hook up with your ex, and then your reaction is that you immediately regret it and feel really ashamed or dirty or something like that. And or you have, that hatred that I was talking about earlier, that could be a form of like self-loathing, that it's like that you crossed the line and you don't hate the other person, but you hate yourself for not being able to say no or something. And so that's another kind of like messy Venus retrograde thing that I could see coming out of this. Um, there's I was thinking that the Pluto also represents a kind of like obsessive quality, and that there's the underworld, and also as the quality of being scary. I mean, a lot of horror movies use the basic underworld, or like, opening the gates of hell, and all these kinds of things as your basic horror fear archetype. um that when you mix this in with a Venus retrograde, it could be like somebody from your past, like, the old ex girl, if we keep going on that stereotype, they show up, but like maybe they are doing it in a way where they're like, you're getting stalked by an ex partner or something like that. Maybe they're not openly contacting you, but they're doing it in a hidden, obsessive, sort of stalkerish way, which is not very good. Um, if you could get like, I don't know if I'm getting too morbid here with my imagining, but like it could be like that your your ex shows up, and the quality of Pluto hatred comes in, that like they are you're with somebody new, but your old ex shows up and they hate your new boyfriend or your new girlfriend or something like that. And now not only do you have the creepy stalker, but you've also got who, I mean, I don't know, you could just spiral out into all sorts of different scenarios. You can kind of see where I'm going with it. Maybe I don't have to spell out all the different like ways that like variations on how these themes could play out, but it's looking fairly dodgy. Maybe as a less a less horror movie kind of thing. I'm also thinking. As I was writing this out, I was also thinking of that movie, Cape Fear, where it's like the guy. It's like about a lawyer, and there's like a criminal that like the lawyer put in jail, and like the lawyer doesn't barely even remembers the case, but the criminal has it like out for the lawyer, and returns basically to get revenge and make the guy's life hell, basically. There's two versions of this. One was an old black and white movie, and then there was I think a Martin Scorsese remake of it that had Nick Nolte and Robert De Niro, with Robert De Niro as the bad guy. But I'm like, I'm almost, to me though, it's like, I don't know if it's as like, it's very Mars and Pluto, that stuff, but I don't know if the Venus retrograde is more like somebody you're friends with, not like an old enemy, or an old like whatever. Like, I don't know if but there's something of that quality though, of like the guy who's long forgotten coming back to seek revenge. That like that's really like goes with Pluto, and also the fact that like I showed you that Mars is getting involved in the mix. Like it could be like a total like Cape Fear vibe or something. Um, I mean, another thing could be like a less dramatic way it could play out is that I do think Pluto can be related to the qualities of jealousy and envy. So you could be like, um, I mean, even if it doesn't manifest in something playing out in a mundane manifest way in life, even if it could just be a psychological thing where like maybe it's like on maybe it's like the whole Facebook jealousy thing, where you see that like maybe an old friend of yours, or oh, like here's a good one, like you see that your ex-girlfriend or ex-boyfriend just got married and they look really happy, and then you feel like a big loser in comparison, and you're all kind of jealous and envious of the life that these other people have, and then you're filled with all this sort of like resentment, and that's a very Pluto vibe, right? So like that, and that could just be like, a person could be feeling these emotions or having these things triggered, but it could be an entirely internal psychological thing, and it doesn't involve the person turning, coming back to like seek revenge, like Cape Fear. You know what I mean? It doesn't have to, like, maybe it doesn't play out like that, but it could be a psychological thing where you're dealing with your own jealousy and envy, and resentment getting triggered by something, especially when relation to maybe a past relationship or something like that. Or it could even be like, I don't know, like it could even be a friend of yours that is more successful than you, and then you're envious and jealous of your old friend's success and stuff like that. It doesn't. It might not have anything to do with like relationship stuff, right? Like, um, but that could still be very Venus and Pluto. Um, and I think it's also like I think that the general mentality of it. I'm remembering there's a line by David Foster Wallace where he said, "Everything I've ever let go of, I've left claw marks." Right, so it's like I think that's another suitable line for Venus retrograde with Pluto, is that especially if you consider like what I said earlier, that synodic cycles represent a kind of or this point of the synodic cycle where Venus goes from being an evening star, having this death rebirth moment, and being reborn as a morning star, starting a new cycle. It's very much kind of like a beginning, an ending, a death, a rebirth. And if there's anything that goes with that, the ending and a beginning, is that in order to have that ending, you need to let go and then to open up the space for something new to begin. And when it comes to these sort of deaths and endings and stuff like that, the more you hang on, like the more you suffer, basically. And the only thing, like, until you realize that there's nothing you can really do except for let it go. But Pluto has this quality that you can explain the archetype, like I said, with the river Styx and the total aversion to crossing over to the other side that goes with death. Like that, like I said, like if you were starving to death, you'd rather eat snails off the ground or something gross like that than escargot. Maybe it's maybe it's not the best example. Maybe people like eating snails, but you'd rather eat something gross than die because the death seems so horrible compared to what it requires you to live, right? Um, so like there's oh, sorry, I'm kind of like lost my train of thought now. But it's basically having a hard time letting go because like if you were like just cool with the fact of your mortality, then you were starving to death, you'd be like, oh, but it's okay. I'll just, like it's just my time has come. I won't bother eating these. But we're biologically wired to like try to find whatever means it is to keep going, right? So there's such an extreme aversion to that release, to that letting go, that we do. Pluto has that quality, right? Like that you do anything but give up and let go, and you're just like hanging on, and it's maybe not even something that you have control over too. I mean, Pluto represents a kind of like the id, the shadow, which could be not even conscious. Like you could consciously have the idea that, wow, it's really in my best interest to let go of this. I should really ought to like, I don't know, like do some affirmations or something and get my mind, used to this idea that of letting go or whatever. And like you could rationally, consciously believe that it's a good thing, but there's some part of you that's involuntarily just still hanging on. And it's not a conscious level at all. It's like it's something like in the body, like it's like you've got that clenching of the gut. I talk about this stuff with my meditation mentor, and it's kind of like in terms of the existential grip. That's it, right? Like which very much relates to this whole thing about mortality, is that we have this kind of grip on life, the grip to keep living, the grip to like control as well. I mean, that's another big one thing with Pluto, is having control over circumstances. Not it's all everything on one side you could see letting go, and then on the other side you could see controlling, hanging on, resisting, and all this kind of stuff. And that's kind of like the Pluto dynamic. I'm having these little like flickers of ideas as I keep going with this, but I'm kind of like I keep kind of like losing my train of thought too. But yeah, the basic existential grip is very Plutonic, and then what we get to see here is that existential grip specifically in relation to Venus things, where we're hanging on when it comes to relationships, when it comes to friendships. And you could apply this to other Venus subjects too, as well as maybe like your artistic creative practice is Venus related as well. But it's not my notes, but when I mentioned that thing about control, that to me is another thing that I need to touch on, which I'm not really prepared of. This is just organically coming up as I go through this stuff. With Venus Pluto, you need to like watch out, because it could indicate relationships or even friendships where people can be controlling. And what I noticed during the ending of one of my friendships that actually corresponded with one of these Venus retrograde cycles is that, like, sometimes it seems like when things are at that point where things are either falling apart, or like a Venus retrograde would bring up the problem areas, bring up these sort of areas of tension, that when some people might react in such a way that when it starts to look like the situation is not as stable as it once was. Like before, this may be a stable friendship or a stable relationship that you could be fairly comfortable with, that you could kind of have some trust that it's not just going to like completely collapse and fall apart. Some people, when they start to have that sense that things are falling apart, that things aren't going the way that they would like them to go, then they might try to counteract that by trying to get more control over the situation, being like, oh, this is not going the way I'd like it to go, so I'd better exert more control over the situation. But in my experience, when it comes to friendships and relationships, it's not really a good thing, because it's like, but the more you try to control the person, it may only have the effect of pushing that person away, because you want to have a free and open kind of thing. You don't want to, it doesn't really, I don't have to explain this, right? I mean, that kind of controlling attitude in friendships and relationships is no good. And if anything, it's maybe more like a bad sign that the end is near when it turns in that direction. That what started off as a casual, relaxed kind of thing going on between a couple people, where it's just naturally people are spending time because they like to, then when the controlling vibe comes in, and it's like, you're not respecting what the other person wants, what the other person feels comfortable with, and you're trying to like force them into something, or trying to like have this tight control over the situation to make it fit with what you would like without respecting other people. That's just bad, but that's one of the things that can come with Pluto that you need to look out for. I mean, there's other things too. There's certain stuff. Pluto, like I said, also stands for what is secret, what is taboo, and as such, it could mean that the retrograde could bring up secret things which we don't know about yet. That there could be things that if there's secrets in the relationship, they could be brought up, or things that happen in the retrograde could bring out that act of repressing as well, I guess you could say. Um, and I also think that I'm just kind of going back to my notes here. The Pluto also could do with things that are like really, really old. That like it could be things that are from so long ago that they don't seem to be relevant today at all. But that making a reappearance and in one way or another, I mean, that could even just be, psychological as well. Like there could be that like there's somebody you haven't thought of in a long time, and then something reminds you of that person, and then it opens up all this stuff, and you're like, oh, I have some sort of unprocessed thing from 10 years ago or whenever, and I haven't even looked at that. And then, maybe you work it out with your therapist or something. It doesn't necessarily even need to involve the other person. That could just be a psychological thing. But yeah, so this is like a whole bunch of Venus Pluto retrograde stuff. That like I actually did a video recently on Venus and Pluto together, but didn't even scratch the surface of some of the stuff that I'm getting into now. So it's good that I didn't try to do all of this in one video, especially the retrograde stuff. But okay, I'm just gonna. Okay, so like as a recap, basically, you've got as you can see, as I've illustrated, that the presence of Pluto in this retrograde could make things considerably more difficult in a variety of different ways, and hopefully that I've kind of hammered that home. But it's not just the Pluto thing, unfortunately. But as I showed earlier, that this culminates, like the whole thing ends Venus stations direct with Mars sneaking up for this conjunction, right? So the problem, the problem with this is that if the Venus and Pluto stuff wasn't bad enough on its own, that the presence of Mars getting in on the action makes it significantly more difficult, because Mars, it generally stands for things like fighting and violence and aggression and all this kind of stuff like that. So what I would say is, like, we're all going to be going through this Venus retrograde, and because we are into astrology and we have this power of foresight, we have these convenient astrological applications where we can see what's happening in the future. We can see that where this Venus retrograde is headed is not going to be a very good place for Venus by the time we get to the end of it. So, and one thing, you can adjust your expectations accordingly. Don't necessarily expect everything to like turn out all rosy from this Venus retrograde. But I think we need to keep all this in mind as we navigate the Venus retrograde itself, and to the extent that we have certain choices to make in life, and a certain degree of agency to exert over how we respond to these different events that play out, that to keep in mind that this is all heading in a direction that involves this Venus, Mars, Pluto triple conjunction, which is particularly gnarly. And then after that, Venus enclosed by Mars and Saturn, and then a Venus-Saturn conjunction. It's like, just keep in mind that that's where all this is going, I guess. And the thing with astrology is that regardless of how we choose to navigate these things, the planets are still going to be in their positions, right? So there's nothing that we can do to prevent a Mars-Venus-Pluto conjunction from happening. There's nothing that we can do to prevent Venus from being enclosed between Mars and Saturn. like this, these are all dynamics that we're going to be dealing with, but I believe it makes sense to say that we sow the seeds for tomorrow based on our actions today and such, and that you reap what you sow, etc. And that each of these, as we navigate this, to keep in mind that it's heading in a particularly gnarly direction, and if there's anything that you can do to help sort of cool down any potential, you know, resentment that or anger or hatred, jealousy, all these kinds of I don't know. I don't want to just label everything as negative, but that's kind of what I mean here. Like these sort of like the negative stuff that can come up with the influence of Mars and Pluto, though, to just realize that that's going to be a factor, and to, if there's anything that you like, don't, I mean, basically all I'm saying is don't pour gasoline on the fire if you can help it, and don't, and also adjust your expectations. Like, don't expect that this is just going to turn out all rosy and stuff like that. And then, eventually we do get Venus and Pisces with Jupiter and Neptune, which is going to be interesting, but that's like so far down the line that I think it's kind of getting a little bit ahead of ourselves right now. That I think the main thing is basically kind of like damage control to make sure we're not creating a big mess for ourselves when it could be avoided. And like when it comes to things like friends and stuff like that for the next few months, yeah, like I said, like not to have really high hopes for it, and definitely not to see this as being like the ideal time to reunite and make amends, and it's probably not going to work out very well. That's basically how I read it. It looks pretty messy, and probably better to just play it safe in general. And then after, I don't know, we'll see by the time we get into April. We can reevaluate our Venus situation.